Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from The Hindu and The Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to World Trade Organization, as India has called for WTO action against known tariff barriers and to restore a strong dispute resolution mechanism at the WTO. The second article is related to India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, as the corridor may face delays due to the West Asian crisis as per the Ministry of External Affairs. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified which will be useful for your prelims and mains preparation. Now, the first article is related to World Trade Organization. The context behind it is that India has called for WTO action against the known tariff barriers. India has also advocated for putting in place a strong dispute resolution mechanism at the WTO. So we will discuss the challenges associated with dispute resolution at the WTO, the reforms needed in it, and also another aspect related to India's concerns regarding the agreement on agriculture as well. This is important in GS2 under the topic Important International Institutions, Agencies, Fora, their structure and mandate. Before coming to the dispute resolution aspect specifically, let's first briefly discuss the governance structure, the architecture of the WTO, the goals of the WTO, and the evolutionary history regarding the dispute resolution mechanism itself. First, the governance structure of the WTO. It comprises of a ministerial conference. The ministerial conference is the highest decision-making body of the WTO. It meets once in 2 years and it comprises of all the member countries of the WTO and the customs unions also. And then there is the General Council. The General Council acts as the decision-making body for the day-to-day operations of the WTO and it is based in Geneva. It also acts as the trade policy review body. That is, it reviews the trade policies of various countries, whether they are trade restrictive or not. And it also acts as the dispute settlement body. Whenever there is a dispute between two WTO member countries, usually if consultations fail, then it is referred to the dispute settlement body and the expert panel which is formed submits its report to the dispute settlement body. It can be reviewed in front of the appellate body as well. And it also oversees 3 councils. The General Council oversees the Council for Trade in Goods, the Council for Trade in Services, and the Council for Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. Therefore, the dispute settlement is done through the dispute settlement body itself, and the appeals can be filed in front of the appellate body. Then there are some specialized committees also. For example, the specialized committees on agriculture, anti-dumping practices, customs valuation, the market access, rules of origin, etc. under the Council for Trade in Goods, and the committees on trade in financial services, specific commitments, etc. under the Council for Trade in Services. Now let's also have an idea regarding the goals of the WTO. Why do we need this multilateral mechanism? It ensures that the economic benefits are reaped by everyone. It ensures that the trade barriers are removed. If the trade barriers are removed, then the prices for the consumers come down because the custom duties imposed by various countries, they are collected by the governments and the prices are borne by the consumers. Likewise, the costs of production will also come down because the custom duty upon the raw materials which are used by various businesses will also come down, and therefore it affords the choices also for the consumers. Thus, it ensures economic growth for the businesses also and for the governments. It ensures development and equity because it ensures economic growth for the developing countries also and the employment generation in the developing countries also, because the industries, the businesses in the developing nations which are not as cost competitive, they are also safeguarded through the WTO mechanisms, and the weaker nations, they also find a voice at the multilateral platform. Otherwise, there will be a power imbalance in the global economic architecture. The WTO also ensures that the environmental and the social goals of the world are met. while maintaining a balance with the economic goals also. Thus, it ensures that the environmental, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, they are not disguised trade barriers. Rather, they are to achieve the environmental goals which are for the global common, and it therefore balances the trade with other priorities. For example, ensuring access to the medicines which are otherwise costly, therefore allowing for the compulsory licensing for the costly medicines which are required for the public purpose. Likewise, the WTO ensures the global stability. It ensures peace, it ensures that there is less protectionism and there is less global economic uncertainty, ultimately leading to peace. Now, coming to the dispute resolution aspect specifically, before the current dispute settlement understanding, we had the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. The GATT of 1947, Article 23, Subclause 2 specifically, if there was a dispute between two countries, the trade dispute, it was sought to be resolved through bilateral negotiations. If bilateral negotiations failed, then decision was sought to be taken through consensus. And if that could also not be done, then later independent panels were formed and those panels gave binding reports. But there was a weakness in this system of GATT. The weakness was that the consensus was sought to be implemented through the positive consensus rule, which means that consensus has to be got from all the parties. Even if one party says no to a decision taken at the meeting, then that decision cannot be implemented. Therefore, there is a kind of a veto power even for the losing party. The party which lost at such a dispute, then that party has also a virtual veto power. Post that, the Uruguay round happened, and that was the birthplace of the present dispute settlement understanding. This dispute settlement understanding is like the rule book for the dispute resolution mechanism at the WTO. What were the reforms through this? First, the negative consensus was adopted rather than positive consensus. Negative consensus essentially means that even if a party does not agree with the decision taken, the decision can still be implemented. The decision will not be implemented if all the members do not agree with that decision. Plus, it prescribed for strict timelines also. It observed that there will be 1 year given for the panel to give the ruling regarding the trade dispute. And if that panel ruling is appealed in the appellate body, then maximum 15 months will be there for deciding that dispute. And the appellate body will be taking up only the legal review regarding the appeals filed against the panel reports. And there will be no unilateral blocking of the rulings. That virtual veto power kind of a provision that was there in the GATT is no more there. Now let's also discuss briefly the dispute settlement process under the WTO. First, when there is a dispute between two countries, the bilateral consultations take place. This is the mandatory first step. Unless consultation takes place, unless the consultation fails, an expert panel is not formed. Once the consultations also fail in 60 days, then an expert panel is formed. The expert panel is formed within 45 days and the formation of the expert panel cannot be blocked by the losing party after 2 meetings of the dispute settlement body. The panel gives its report to the dispute settlement body. The panel gives its report within 6 months. The timeline can be extended by another 3 months. And the appeals can also be filed against the decisions of the dispute settlement body. These appeals are filed and reviewed in front of a 7-member appellate body. Once the appellate body gives its final decision, it is implemented. How does the implementation take place? Usually, a reasonable period is given to the losing party for the compliance with the decision of the appellate body. If the losing party does not comply with the ruling of the appellate body, then compensation negotiations take place. That is, the losing party has to pay compensation for the economic damages that the winning party is suffering. And if that is also not given, then trade sanctions can be imposed upon. The trade sanctions are authorized by the dispute settlement body and the winning party can impose the trade sanctions as a retaliatory measure against the losing party. But there are certain challenges in the present dispute settlement understanding. One, it causes sovereignty concerns because the WTO panels, they review the domestic legislations. They overreach their mandate, they interfere into the domestic legislations, domestic policy making, for example, the taxation laws, the taxes imposed upon the exports and imports, and at times they resort to the judicial lawmaking also. For example, when the explicit rules regarding a particular situation is not made, then the expert panels framed by the WTO, they fill in the gaps, resorting to judicial lawmaking. And the appellate body is also undergoing a crisis, especially since 2019, because the USA blocked the appellate body judge appointments. Therefore, the countries, they are going for ad hoc arbitration. For example, European Union Canada interim appeal arrangement. India is not so enthusiastic regarding such ad hoc arrangements. Plus, there are institutional challenges also. For example, due to the lack of staff and the funds, there is immense workload and delays in the resolving of the disputes filed in the WTO, and there is a lack of transparency also. The chief reason being that the hearings are not open court hearings, they are conducted behind closed doors. And also there are risks of the bias. There are risks that the judges are politically influenced because most of the appointees are coming from the Western nations, the developed nations. Now, let's have a look at how India has suffered at the WTO because of the adverse rulings by the WTO against India in the cases filed against India and mostly by USA. First is the case study related to the agricultural products. USA challenged India's import bans. India had imposed import bans upon poultry and eggs, citing avian influenza concerns. USA alleged that it amounted to the violation of the WTO rules regarding the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. The rulings of the expert panel and the appellate body were against India. It held that the import bans, they did not have any scientific basis. The import bans amounted to overtly restrictive, trade restrictive practices. Therefore, we learnt a lesson. We ensured that there is a revision of the sanitary and phytosanitary measures as per the WTO rules, and we realized that there is a need for evidence-based trade policies. Therefore, we put in place disease surveillance programs, and the risk assessments were also made WTO compliant. Another case study is related to the solar cells and modules. Again in 2013, USA challenged the domestic content requirement that India had under the solar mission, that the solar cells and solar modules, there must be certain amount of domestic content. And again USA alleged that there is a violation of the TRIMS and the national treatment rules. So we again learned the lesson that rather than going for overt protectionism, we should go for innovation driven policies. Therefore, we shifted our focus to R&D, tax incentives, competitiveness, and we maintained a balance between trade versus environmental goals. Another case study is again related to export subsidies. USA challenged again India's merchandise export from India scheme export subsidies. This time there was an alleged violation of WTO's countervailing measures agreement. Therefore, we phased out the MEIS scheme and we introduced the WTO compliant RODTEP scheme, that is the remission of duties and taxes from the exported products, and therefore the tax and duty refunds are given over the direct subsidies. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give for reforming the WTO dispute resolution mechanism? One, even before forming the expert panels of the WTO, there can be resolution mechanisms before that mandating mediation and conciliation, that the two disputing parties must go for mediation or conciliation, and even a non-binding arbitration mechanism can also be put in place if the dispute is regarding sensitive issues, sovereignty issues. We need to strengthen the appellate body and the expert panels of the WTO also by making sure that there are permanent judges so that there are lesser allegations of bias and lesser political influences, and the proceedings must be transparent. For introducing transparency, the proceedings can be conducted publicly, there can be public hearings, and there can be alternative enforcement mechanisms also. Rather than going for imposing trade sanctions, especially upon the weaker economies, we can go for monetary compensation which can be awarded towards the winning party. Likewise, rather than authorizing retaliatory measures, we can impose fines for the non-compliance. Likewise, judicial independence has to be ensured. For that, we can put in place a standing WTO court with expert judges, and there can be clearer legal boundaries so that the sovereignty is not violated, so that the WTO dispute settlement mechanism does not overreach its mandate. Now, another aspect which is of particular concern for India is related to agriculture subsidies at the WTO. It is extremely important because agriculture employs 45% of India's population and agriculture contributes to 17% of India's GDP. We want to double the farmers' income. We want to double the agriculture exports from India. Therefore, the WTO first put in place the Agreement on Agriculture. This is based upon three pillars essentially. One is the market access. The market access is sought to be ensured by reducing the tariffs. The reduction commitments were given by both the developed countries and the developing countries. The developed countries agreed to reduce the tariffs upon the agriculture imports by 36% over a period of 6 years, and the developing countries agreed to reduce the tariffs upon the agriculture imports by 24% over a period of 10 years. Additionally, some tariff rate quotas were decided. That is, if the agriculture related import is more than a certain limit, then extra tariffs can also be imposed. The second pillar was related to domestic support. That is, the support, the subsidies that the governments can give to support their farmers can also be limited as per the Agreement on Agriculture. There will be some subsidies which will be classified as the green box subsidies. There will be no limits on the green box subsidies on either the developed or the developing countries. These will be non-trade distorting subsidies. For example, the subsidies for research, subsidies for climate resilience, etc. Then there will be blue box subsidies which are not as much trade distorting. For example, the production limiting subsidies as are given by European Union, for example. Then there are development box subsidies which are special provisions for the special and differential treatment for the poor farmers. For example, they can be given the subsidies for the inputs like the subsidies on fertilizers and seeds, etc. And then there are the amber box subsidies which are trade distorting in nature and they need to be curbed, and there is a cap on the amber box subsidies which can be given by the developing and the developed countries as per the Agreement on Agriculture. For example, India's MSP price deficiency payments, they are classified under the amber box subsidies. And the third pillar was related to promoting of the export competition in the agriculture. Therefore, the export subsidies were sought to be phased out. These issues were discussed through the Doha round and the Nairobi Ministerial Conference. The Doha Development Agenda, it focused upon the developing nations' concerns. For example, the concerns related to the agriculture, the concerns related to the trips and medicines. For example, it allowed the compulsory licensing for the medicines for the public purpose. Likewise, it allowed for the special and differential treatment for the developing countries, including even India and China, and that became a matter of debate later on whether the developing countries like India and China should get special benefits as per the special and differential treatment mechanism as per the Doha Development Round. But through the Nairobi round, the Doha agenda was put on the back burner because USA declared that the Doha round is dead. It tried to push ahead new issues at the WTO. The new issues related to e-commerce, investment, competition policy, etc. The developing nations whereas demanded that there should be special safeguard mechanisms for the farmers. The subsidies given to them, they should not be treated as trade distorting, and there should be protections for the food security programs also. Now, what are the issues in the Agreement on Agriculture? One, the policy space has shrunk significantly over a period of time because the MSP calculations which are done by the WTO to calculate the trade distorting impact of the MSP, it is flawed because it is still based upon the 1986-1988 external reference price. It has to be updated. It does not take into account the inflation. If inflation is accounted, then India should be able to give more support to the farmers, and despite that it should be within the limits which are allowed as per the WTO. And there are often attacks by the developed countries on the special and differential treatments which are allowed for the developing countries and the low income farmers under the WTO rules. For example, the input subsidies are required for the low income farmers who are 99% in India. Plus, there is a push from the developed countries to cap the development box flexibilities which are allowed under the WTO. Also, we have the concerns related to food security in India, and the FCI procurement, the PDS mechanism, that is also criticized at the WTO. Therefore, we need a permanent solution. Temporary solutions like the Bali Peace Clause regarding the agriculture stock holdings will not work for a long time. And we need special safeguard mechanisms also. Therefore, there is the demand to allow the tariffs to counter the import surges also at times. Now, what can we recommend regarding the agriculture? One, we need to fix the imbalances in the agreement on agriculture. The aggregate measurement of support entitlements which are given for the developed, they are too high. They need to be reduced. Also, the external reference price which is used for the calculation of the MSP and such support mechanisms, it should also be updated. The special and differential treatment mechanisms allowed for the developing countries and the low income farmers, this should be protected, and there should be no caps on the development box subsidies. There should be a permanent solution for the public stock holding also. Special safeguard mechanisms should be there to counter the import surges, and the export policies need to be reformed, and we need to ensure that we have WTO compliant schemes. For example, the remission of duties and taxes on the exported products scheme. Also, we need to strengthen the alliances. For example, we can lead the G33 coalition to ensure that there is a rules-based global trade order. There has to be domestic coordination also. The interministerial collaboration is required for ensuring that the policies framed are WTO compliant. There is a means practice question also. The dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO has been central to enforcing global trade rules. Explain the process of dispute settlement under the WTO. What challenges has the mechanism faced in recent years, particularly with respect to the appellate body? Suggest reforms to enhance its effectiveness. Please try to write it. The next article is related to India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. The context behind it is that the Ministry of External Affairs has observed that the corridor could face delays due to the crisis in the West Asia. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor is also facing other challenges. For example, the competition from the China-led Belt and Road Initiative, the challenge of harmonization of regulatory standards across countries along this route. So we will discuss the key features of this corridor, the challenges in building it, and the opportunities for India. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor was announced in September 2023 during the G20 summit. It is a multimodal corridor. It starts from India, Mundra in Gujarat or Mumbai in Maharashtra to UAE. There is the shipping route, and then the rail link through Saudi Arabia, and then onwards from Israel to Europe. The Haifa port in Israel is a critical nodal point from where the shipping route will start. And the countries invested in it include India, USA, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Italy, France, Germany, and the European Union. The aim is to build the corridors including the transport corridor, digital corridor, and the energy corridor, which will comprise of the renewable energy grid and the clean hydrogen corridor. What's the geopolitical and geoeconomic rationale behind it? It has emerged from the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were brokered between Israel and UAE by the USA, and subsequently the I2U2 grouping was formed: India, Israel, USA, and UAE. And therefore, US also wants the inclusion of Saudi Arabia as well. Now, Saudi Arabia's inclusion will ensure that the normalization of the ties between Israel and the Arab world will take place. And this corridor is referred to as the peace train. The peace train which will bring about the regional stability and the peace in the region because of the trade. But there are certain recent conflicts also which have been disrupting the momentum of the building of this corridor. The conflicts include the Israel-Hamas war, and also the attacks by the Houthis in the Red Sea. Now, what is the impact of regional conflicts upon the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor? One, the Houthi rebels have been attacking on the shipping in the Red Sea. The attacks on the commercial ships has led to the disruption of the route, and the commercial ships have deviated towards the Cape of Good Hope, 30% of the global shipping which goes through this region. And Egypt and Turkey, they see it as a challenge towards their trade dominance in the region. For example, Egypt through the Suez Canal controls significant trade, and the Arab-Israel tensions also disrupt the momentum of this corridor. Now, what are the key features of the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor? One, it seeks to build a transport connectivity. That will be done through the two legs, the eastern leg and the western leg. The eastern leg comprises of the shipping and the land route from India to UAE. It will be a shipping route, and after that the land route, the rail links through West Asia onto the Haifa port in Israel. And the western leg will comprise of the shipping route again from the Haifa port towards Europe. This route will be 40% faster than the Suez Canal route. But there are certain challenges which need to be addressed. For example, the rail networks in the West Asia are weak. The Saudi and UAE, they have an economic rivalry also. And the regulatory standards across the countries in the region, they have to be harmonized. It also seeks to build a digital connectivity. The digital connectivity will be built through laying the undersea data cables. These undersea data cables will be a counter to China's peace cables which it has laid in the region, and it will be utilizing the 5G networks again as a response and a counter to Huawei and the ZTE networks, and it will seek to integrate the UPI also, Unified Payment Interface, which is already used in Saudi Arabia, UAE and France. It also seeks to build an energy connectivity by ensuring that there are renewable energy grids which are built, and by building a clean hydrogen corridor. Therefore, it will solve the energy trilemma for the emerging economies in the region. That is, we need access, we need affordability, and we need green energy. All these dilemmas of the economies of this region will be solved. But the renewable energy has the challenge. The challenge is the intermittency. And if we go ahead for the storage, then the battery storage is costly. Now this challenge will be solved through the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, because through the cross-border grid connectivity, the storage will not be required and the intermittency issues will be resolved. The benefit for India will be, we will be able to import green energy when the domestic production is low, and we will be able to export our excess solar power when there is excess production. And despite the West Asia having high potential for the solar energy production, the production there is pretty low. It is just 10% of the total energy production in the West Asian region, and it also supports India's initiative of One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative. The green hydrogen corridor which is being built will be beneficial for the heavy industries and for the long distance transport. And India has already started ramping up the green hydrogen production. India has the plans to give $2 billion incentives as per a scheme for 5 million tons production per year by 2030. The private sector investments are also encouraged. For example, the investments by Reliance and Adani in green hydrogen production. But it will be facing certain challenges also. For example, the production cost will be high, which is to the tune of $6 to $8 per kg, whereas the target is $1 per kg, and we will need cheaper electrolyzers and the technology sharing from the other nations also. What will be the role of the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor in this? We will be getting the export market for the clean hydrogen, green hydrogen that we produce, and we can go for the co-development of the hydrogen technology also. But there are certain challenges with the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor. One, it is facing competition from the Belt and Road Initiative of China. The BRI is China-centric model. It goes for the debt trap diplomacy. For example, they have taken the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka on lease for 99 years, and they go for such coercive measures, and they are shifting the Chinese production to those markets where the labor is cheaply available. And the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor will rather function as a plurilateral partnership, and the economic benefits will be mutually shared. For example, the development of green and resilient infrastructure. It also faces the challenge of geopolitical risks. For example, the Israel-Hamas war will disrupt the building of the corridor, the Saudi-UAE economic rivalry, and the implementation hurdles are also there. For example, the corridor has a long gestation period. It will be built over a period of 5 to 10 years, and the regulations have to be harmonized across different countries. The regulations related to, for example, the customs and the infrastructure gaps have to be filled, for example, building strong rail links, the high speed rail links in the West Asian region. The financing will also be another concern. The corridor may get financing from the G7's infrastructure fund, which is a huge fund of $600 billion, and the UAE and Saudi may also invest. The UAE has pledged to invest $75 billion in India, and Saudi has also pledged $100 billion in India. We can get finance from the Islamic finance also, for example, the interest-free loans from the Gulf states, and the EU's Global Gateway, which is also a significant fund for developing sustainable infrastructure, can also be tapped into. Now, what are the opportunities for India regarding this corridor? One, it will help us in countering the protectionist tag. We got the protectionist tag after our exit from the RCEP, which was affecting our economic interests. And we'll be able to get the leadership in the renewable energy and the digital trade in this region. We will be having the economic opportunities also. For example, our trade with the Gulf Cooperation Council with the Gulf region is already to the tune of $180 billion plus per year. There is a scope of another increase by 40% if the corridor is realized. We will be able to gain entry into the global value chains also. And infrastructure synergies will happen. For example, the combination of the Indian ports Mumbai and Kochi and the combination of UAE and Saudi rail networks, which lead to a faster route along Asia to Europe. And the Gulf Cooperation Council investments can also be tapped into. We will be able to nudge some financial reforms in this region. For example, the sovereign risk funds of various nations can also be tapped into to ensure that the IMEC projects are hedge funded, and the regulatory easing can also happen. The supply chain resilience will also be ensured through this corridor because the trade costs will be brought down, and we will be insulated against the global shocks, the shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic. And India's labor, India's natural resources, and the West Asia and Europe's markets combined together will bring about the shared economic growth and prosperity for everyone. Therefore, the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor serves as a strategic counter to the Belt and Road Initiative. It will ensure geopolitical stability since there will be inextricably linked economic and trade ties built over a period of time, and it will lead to multilateral coordination also. And if realized, it could reshape the trade routes, the energy flows, and the digital connectivity also between Asia, Middle East, and European Union. There is a mains practice question also. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor is being hailed as a transformative connectivity initiative. Discuss the key features of the IMEC and examine the strategic and economic opportunities it offers for India. Also highlight the major challenges in its implementation. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the Indian Railways on the path to achieve the net zero emissions by 2030. This is important in GS3 under the topic Infrastructure Railways. Before coming to the article, let's first discuss the initiatives taken up by the Indian Railways to achieve the net zero emissions by 2030. The transport sector greenhouse gas emissions are accounting for 12% of the total greenhouse gas emissions from India, and 4% out of that is accounted for by the railways. So there is significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions from the railways also which can be brought down. The measures that the railway have taken include the measures for reducing the carbon emission. The railways have installed 142 megawatt solar rooftop capacity and 100 megawatt plus of wind energy as of August 2022. It has gone for the electrification of the broad gauges, the building of dedicated freight corridors, the green certification of the railway establishments. It has also gone for the building of additional carbon sink by going for afforestation on vacant railway land, and it has been planting roughly 1 crore trees annually since past 7 years. It is going for the waste management practices to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the waste. For example, the setting up of waste to energy, compost and biogas plants, and the building of environment friendly bio toilets in the trains also. It has gone for the green certification, that is, the consent to operate is obtained from the state pollution control boards. Now it is also exploring the partnerships with the Solar Energy Corporation of India, the National Thermal Power Corporation, and the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. Now coming to the article, it has been authored by the Minister of Railways, and he has given data to substantiate the claim that the emissions from the railways have been coming down. The environmental impact that it leaves has also been brought down. The railways ferries about 700 crore passengers annually, and the shift from the road to rail has saved 143 million tons of the CO2 emissions, and it is equivalent to planting about 121 crore trees. It has led to 90% less carbon dioxide emissions as compared to the trucks, and it has also resulted in the saving of diesel to the tune of 2800 crore liters of diesel, which will be worth about 2 lakh crore rupees. And it has also saved the logistic cost to the tune of 3.2 lakh crore rupees over the past decade. And the railways have been going for electrification and the push for the usage of renewable energy. 47,000 km has been electrified in the last 11 years. 99% of the broad gauge network has been electrified now. There is green energy adoption for the railway stations, railway workshops, and the trains. There is the building of the dedicated freight corridors. It has led to the reduction in congestion and the emissions. There is also the experimentation with the hydrogen powered train on the Jeen to Sonipat route. It will be the world's most powerful hydrogen powered train. Now, what is the economic impact of these initiatives? One, India's logistics performance has increased. India's ranking in the Logistics Performance Index has improved from 54 in 2014 to 38 in 2023. We have reduced our oil imports due to the railway freight network, and the rail freight is 50% cheaper than the road freight. What are the future goals now? One, the net zero target scope 1 has already been advanced to 2025, and it is in line with India's Panchamrit goals to achieve net zero emissions by 2070. The next article is related to India-Germany relations. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests. Before coming to the article, let's have a brief overview regarding the India-Germany relations. The diplomatic relations between India and Germany were established in 1951. The Strategic Partnership Agreement was subsequently signed in 2000. In 2005, the Indo-German Consultative Committee was formed. And in 2011, the biennial intergovernmental consultations were also launched. In 2019, the 1.5 track dialogue was also initiated under the intergovernmental consultations. What is the significance of India-Germany partnership? One, it is significant from a trade point of view. Germany is India's largest European trade partner, and the trade in 2023 was to the tune of $33 billion. And Germany is also India's 9th largest FDI source. From 2000 to 2023, the FDI was to the tune of $14.5 billion. And India has the skilled workforce and the digital growth capabilities which will be useful for both the countries. From the climate and sustainability point of view, the partnership is significant because Germany has a 10 billion euro commitment under the Green and Sustainable Development Partnership. Germany also supports India-led initiatives like International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and there is the focus upon the solar energy, agroecology, and the green technology. In technology and innovation also there is cooperation, as there is the establishment of Indo-German Science and Technology Center and the initiative of Women in Science and Engineering Research. In defense and security, there is collaboration in the form of 2006 Defense Cooperation Agreement, joint working groups on counter-terrorism, cyber-security and defense collaboration. There are joint exercises ex Milan, PASEX, Tarang Shakti, and it is also part of the China Plus One strategy, and therefore the European Union has also been levying tariffs on the Chinese electric vehicles, and India is seen as an alternative manufacturing hub therefore. But there are certain challenges in the bilateral relations. For example, there are trade barriers like the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the European Union. The bureaucratic hurdles in India also at times limit the FDI coming into India from Germany. There are geopolitical differences. For example, India remained neutral on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, whereas Germany took a strong stance. Likewise, Germany is economically reliant upon China, which leads to clash of interests, and there are at times criticisms from the side of Germany regarding the human rights concerns. For example, the critics regarding the press freedom in India, and at times a critic on Kashmir also. Now, what can be the way forward between the two countries? One, we can go for an early conclusion of India-European Union Free Trade Agreement. The Indo-Pacific engagement can be increased, for example, through naval exercises, through infrastructure investments also. We can go for the collaboration in clean technology, for example, in electric mobility, green hydrogen and renewables. We can collaborate for ensuring supply chain resilience, like diversifying the semiconductor sources, auto parts and pharma away from China. And Germany can support India in India's Make in India initiative regarding the high-tech manufacturing. Now, coming to the article, the author is the German ambassador to India, and he has commended the success that the Indian diaspora has achieved worldwide, as they have become the global leaders in business, industry and academia, and they are driven by strong cultural values and are highly skilled professionals. Therefore, he proposes Germany as a destination for Indian talent. He observes that Germany has a rich academic and scientific legacy. For example, the Nobel Prize dominance, 50 plus Nobel Prizes are linked to Göttingen University alone. Germany has world-class research institutions. For example, Max Planck Society, which has 31 Nobel laureates, Humboldt Foundation, Helmholtz Institutes, and they have an open and merit-based system. There are no economic barriers. For example, education and research is funded by the taxpayers, and there is public-private collaboration also for applied research and innovation. He mentions success stories in innovation. For example, BioNTech, which developed mRNA COVID vaccine, was founded by Turkish immigrants. There are thriving startups and corporate R&D ecosystem in Germany, and German firms invest heavily in research, rivaling even national budgets of some small economies also. Therefore, he is saying that there are opportunities for Indian students and professionals, as 50,000 plus Indian students are already there in Germany, and there is a high demand in the science, technology, engineering and medicine fields. And regarding the language, he observes that English is used in academia and research, and Germany has a welcoming culture for the skilled migrants. But Germany is seeking talent. It might lead to brain drain for India then. Therefore, the author says you are very welcome. The next article is related to battery energy storage systems. This is important in GS3 under the topic infrastructure energy. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the battery energy storage systems. Why are they needed? Because we will be transitioning from fossil fuel driven energy to renewable energy. And the renewable energy is intermittent in nature, therefore we will need storage solutions for the grid stability, and we will need it for ensuring energy security, peak load management, as well as the integration of the charging infrastructure for the electric vehicles. What are the technologies which are usually used for the battery energy storage systems? One, we can use the lithium ion batteries. They are most common, they are having high efficiency and have a fast response, fast charging, fast discharging. Then there can be flow batteries which are having long duration storage and have better cycle life. These solid state batteries are the emerging technology. They have the higher energy density and they are safer. And the lead acid batteries are low cost but they have a shorter lifespan. Then there can be chemical energy storage also, which can store energy in chemical bonds rather than the battery form. But there are certain challenges in the battery energy storage systems. One, they are high cost solutions. It is expensive technology, plus we have to import the materials required for making the batteries. There are supply chain risks. For example, we need to import the lithium, cobalt and nickel. There are environmental concerns also. For example, the recycling of the battery can also cause damage to the environment, and there are disposal risks also. There is the efficiency decline over a period of time. The battery degrades and the amount of charge that it can hold also comes down. The policy uncertainty is also there because of the lack of clear incentives regarding the battery energy storage solutions, and there is the safety risk also because there is a fire hazard in the lithium ion batteries when they are overheated. What are the government initiatives for the battery energy storage systems? One, there is the National Energy Storage Mission for promoting the domestic manufacturing capabilities. The productivity linked incentive scheme provides for 80,000 crores for the battery production. The viability gap funding is also provided for building 4 gigawatt hour projects. The energy storage obligation also mandates the storage backed renewables production, and the green hydrogen policy promotes the battery energy storage systems for the hydrogen projects. And through the FAME India scheme, Solar Energy Corporation of India and the NTPC pilots, the storage adoption is being boosted now. Now coming to the article, the energy security is now based upon 4 pillars: the availability, accessibility, affordability and the environmental acceptability. Therefore, we need to ensure that we have clean energy access for achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 7, and for that the climate risks have to be taken into account, and with the geopolitical tensions we need to develop our own battery energy storage systems also. When we look at the landscape of battery energy storage systems in India, we have the target of achieving 500 gigawatt of non-fossil capacity of energy production by 2030. 217 gigawatt have been achieved by January 2025, and we want to achieve 47 gigawatt of battery energy storage systems by 2032. But there are certain challenges. For example, the grid upgrades are slow and the deployment of the battery energy storage systems is slow, and we have critical minerals shortages, for example lithium and cobalt, which have to be imported, and there are financing gaps also for the large scale projects. What is the way forward for India? We need to expedite the large scale BESS projects for central and state grids. We can boost the local manufacturing, for example setting up giga factories for lithium ion batteries, and we can go for alternative chemistries also. We can secure the critical minerals via global partnerships and domestic mining as well. We can enhance the recycling and the second life battery usages. We can also leverage the alliances, for example build BESS consortium with other like-minded countries. The next article is related to census of 1931. This is important in GS1 under the topic Modern Indian History, Significant Events and Issues, and it is also important in society under population and associated issues. The upcoming census will be conducted in 2 phases. The key feature of the upcoming census will be that it will be the first caste-based census since 1931. That is, it will be having data beyond the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe data which was included in the earlier censuses also. When we look at the 1931 census, it faced logistical challenges. For example, it covered the British India from Balochistan to Myanmar, that was part of the undivided India, and the enumerators faced various difficulties. They had to cover vast areas. At the same time, the non-cooperation movement was also taking place. Gandhi's Salt March also coincided with the 1931 census, and that was the time of economic distress also, because the Great Depression had happened then, which reduced the funding. Therefore, the enumerators were also unpaid. 20 lakh teachers and government staff volunteered for the 1931 census. The census also faced political and social resistance. For example, Congress boycotted it. The census boycott Sunday was there on January 11, 1931, but it had limited impact except in Gujarat, Ahmedabad, Surat and Mumbai. There were local challenges also. For example, the Bhils refused the house numbering, saying that it is against our culture based upon superstitious grounds mostly, and the enumerators were also attacked in some regions. There was a tiger attack also in Bastar which interrupted the inspection. The findings of the 1931 census said that the population at that time was about 35 crore and there was a 10% growth approximately versus 1% from 1911 to 1921. The reasons for the population growth were improved healthcare, no major epidemics and the universal marriage, etc. The population density, when we observe, the lowest was there in Balochistan, the highest was there in Cochin state and the Dhaka division. The major cities which were mostly populated included Kolkata, followed by Mumbai, followed by Chennai. The caste enumeration happened in 1931 also. At that time, the race, tribe or caste were asked, and that were being asked since 1872. The opposition was there at that time in Punjab. For example, the Arya Samaj influenced the Hindus to declare their caste as unspecified. At that time, more than 18 lakh people reported their caste as nil and 98% of such people were from Bengal. The challenges were that the fluid caste terminology was there. For example, the same caste was there with different surnames. Therefore, at that time, the superintendent of Madras observed that the caste sorting is not worthwhile because of the fluid appellations. Now, how is it relevant for census 26-27 also? Because the debate continues now also regarding the methodology for the caste data collection, the caste data utility and the political implications of the same. The lessons that we can derive from 1931 census are that we need to balance the accuracy versus the social resistance, and we need to address the logistical hurdles in the diverse regions. The next article is related to census, the caste count and the delimitation impact. This is important in GS1 under population and in GS2 under government policies and interventions. Now census 2027 will be conducted in two phases, the house listing phase and the population enumeration. The reference date approximately will be March 1, 2027, and the digital enumeration will be done for ensuring faster data processing. The provisional data is expected by March 2027 and the final report will only come by late 2027. But there are some political reactions also against it. For example, Tamil Nadu Chief Minister has observed that Centre has delayed the census to reduce the southern states' parliamentary representation, and he has been demanding for fair delimitation and extension of the 1971 census-based delimitation until 2056. Now, when we come to the delimitation process especially, the constitution mandates that it is required after the first census post 2026 as per the articles 81 and 82, and therefore the delimitation act has to be passed by the parliament. Post that, the delimitation commission has to be formed, which will be headed by a retired Supreme Court judge and the election commission officials. Then the formula will be devised, that is the population per constituency will be devised after the stakeholder consultations, and then constitutional amendment will be needed to increase the Lok Sabha seats. At present it is capped at 550. But the southern states have the fear that they may end up losing the seats due to better population control versus the northern states, because the northern India is still experiencing the demographic dividend, but the southern India, there the population has already started stagnating or even declining. The DMK resolution even opposes the census-based delimitation also. There is a link to the women reservation also for the delimitation, because women are given 33% reservation in the parliament and that is tied to delimitation. Opposing delimitation can be seen to be anti-women. What has been the situation till now? The delimitation has been frozen since the 1971 census. The 2002 amendment, the 84th amendment to the constitution, extended this freeze until the first census after 2026. Therefore, the current boundaries are based upon the 2001 census, but the seat numbers remain as per the 1971 census. But even before the completion of the census, the operational challenges need to be sorted out. For example, 25 to 30 lakh enumerators will be required, they will be deployed, and the digital processes may reduce the discrepancies between the provisional and the final data. The Gazette notification will provide the exact schedule. Thank you.